All right, let's dive straight into this explainer. We're unpacking the deep, frankly mind-bending mysteries of how human consciousness actually works. We're going to explore the brilliant ideas of cognitive scientist Douglas Hofstadter, pulling from his legendary work Gödel, Escher, Bach, and his deeply personal follow-up, I Am a Strange Loop. We're going on a wild ride today, from visual illusions to ant colonies to the very limits of artificial intelligence, and finally to the nature of the human soul itself.
Take a look at this image. I want you to tell me what the message is. Because honestly, what you perceive here is the ultimate hook for understanding how the layers of our mind operate.
At first glance, right, the answer is just staring us right in the face. It's simply the word mu. Now, in Zen philosophy, mu is this famous answer that essentially unasks a flawed question. It's bold, it's crystal clear, and it really just seems to be the whole shebang.
But let's zoom in a little bit here. Notice anything? The larger pieces making up those letters of mu are actually copies of a totally different word, holism. So suddenly, bam, that top-level meaning just vanishes, and the second, intermediate level of meaning pops right out.
And if we zoom in even further, it gets crazier. This perfectly illustrates how holism itself is made up of these tiny individual copies of the word reductionism. I mean, talk about missing the forest for the trees, or, well, the trees for the forest. It shows us that what we see is totally dependent on the level of structure we choose to tune into. This whole visual illusion perfectly anchors our first major concept here, which is holism. Basically, holism argues that any strictly reductionistic explanation of a complex system, like, say, a human brain, is just going to fail to explain where consciousness or a soul comes from. You literally can't just stare at the tiny pieces and expect to understand the beautiful overarching pattern.
On the flip side, we have reductionism. This argues that by looking at things from a vast, bottom-up perspective, you can effectively just drain a system of all that mysterious meaning. If you only look at the statistical behavior of the basic building blocks following natural laws, that higher-level purpose suddenly becomes completely superfluous.
So here's the absolutely crucial point. How does meaning actually emerge from meaningless blocks? To explain this, Hofstadter uses this magnificent analogy of an ant colony. He asks how a bunch of dumb, randomly wandering ants can form a highly intelligent conversational colony, a colony he playfully calls Ant Hillary. Because on their own, ants don't have the brainpower to hold a conversation. They're just like individual meaningless letters scattered in a book.
Let's look at how this hierarchy builds from the bottom up. You start with small groups of randomly wandering ants, right? They cross a threshold to form teams. Then, these teams act as signals that carry information across the colony, eventually dissolving to drop ants right where they're needed. When you zoom out to the macro level, these signals group together to form active symbols, and it's the interaction of these high-level symbols that is actually capable of thought, response, and conversation. The ants, they are just the medium. The active symbols are the actual message.
It's exactly like M.C. Escher's intertwining ants forming a unified pattern. The neurons in our brains fire and swoop to create a coherent whole. No single neuron is conscious, just like no single ant is conscious. Meaning and consciousness are just high-level properties that get lifted right out of the hardware. So intelligence is basically a software property. It's completely dependent on those lower levels, but entirely distinct from them. To really drive this home, think about Hofstadter's story of J.S. Fermat. This was an incredibly organized ant colony that got destroyed by a sudden freak flood. Now, the physical ants themselves survived by floating on twigs, but the organization, the actual self of the colony, was utterly wiped out. But over months, those exact same surviving ants regrouped, and they formed a totally new entity, Ant Hillary. She was a brand new sum of the exact same old parts, because the physical stuff didn't dictate the identity, the abstract pattern did. Now, this idea of reading different levels of meaning isn't just some quirky analogy about bugs. It was actually at the very core of all that wild optimism surrounding artificial intelligence back in the 1970s. The big goal was to figure out how to program a system that could leap from those low-level rigid rules to high-level flexible symbol manipulation.
Just think about the famous chess computer, Deep Blue. Deep Blue can play chess flawlessly, but it's using narrow, lower-level rules and brute force calculation. It literally has no idea what chess actually is. It's never going to get bored and asked to talk about poetry instead, right? Human general intelligence, on the other hand, has the power to abstract. We can step outside the rigid rules of a game to a meta level. We can perceive the mu instead of just the reductionism. So its mind, meaning, and intelligence are just these patterns of abstraction that can theoretically run on any hardware, whether that's ants, neurons, or silicon chips. Douglas Hofstadter realized this leads to a really profound, honestly kind of startling conclusion about the human soul.
He argues that the self isn't some magical inner essence present the moment we're born. In fact, he goes as far as suggesting newborn babies are only potentially human beings in terms of consciousness. The self is a lifelong construction. It's an abstract, self-referential loop, a strange loop, that just emerges naturally over years from that porridge-like matter inside our skulls. It's literally a pattern that learns to point at itself and say, I.
Now, I know this sounds like a very clinical, philosophical theory, but following the tragic and sudden passing of his wife in 1993, Hofstadter had to actually test this exact philosophy against his own brutal grief. He was forced to ask the ultimate question. If the self really is just an abstract pattern, does that pattern completely disappear when the physical brain perishes?
Well, because the self is an abstract pattern, kind of like a song or a high-level symbol in an ant colony, he realized that spouses deeply interpenetrate each other's mental lives over the years. They learn each other's desires, their inside jokes, their reactions. And what this means is that his wife's specific, unique pattern was actually instantiated, sure, maybe rendered in lower resolution, but genuinely existing right within his own physical brain. Take a second to really absorb this. This isn't just poetry or sentimentality here. Hofstadter came to a really rigorous conclusion. His wife's unique point of view wasn't just some passive memory. It was a very real, surviving, active pattern that was still looping and living inside the neural hardware of the people she loved. She genuinely lived on to see her children grow through the physical hardware of her surviving family.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this one provocative thought. We spend so much of our time worrying about the physical hardware of our bodies, but if Hofstadter is right, our true essence is really the pattern we weave. So think about the people you love, the people you influence, those deep conversations you have. If your soul is just a strange loop, who else is currently carrying a piece of your pattern?